This is The World This Weekend. Hello, I'm Stephanie Skandaris. The wait to leave the fighting in Gaza drags on for Canadian Palestinians.
It's a very frustrating time. My father is a 73-year-old man. He went to Gaza on vacation. That turned to a huge nightmare.
Also, the carbon tax reprieve continues to divide Canadians as some provinces look for a way to fight back.
I think they need a lot more help than just a few cents a litre on their heating oil.
And after a triumphant Pan Am Games, Team Canada sets its sights on the Olympics.
I really wanted to show everyone that I was a top competitor, and I think I'm proving that more and more. Heading into the Olympic Games, I'm just really looking forward to being able to show Canada that we can do it.
That's later, but first. The United States' top diplomat made a surprise visit to the West Bank today. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. According to the U.S. State Department, the two discussed the need for humanitarian assistance in Gaza and plans for the enclave after the war. Ellen Morrow reports.
A body is pulled from the rubble of a destroyed apartment block, the aftermath of an apparent Israeli airstrike at the Al-Maghazi refugee camp. At least 50 people were reportedly killed. A nearby hospital was filled with the injured. The Israeli military hasn't claimed responsibility for the strike, but says it's looking into it. Tonight, more blasts near Al-Quds Hospital in Gaza City, filled with patients and the displaced. Dozens were hurt, says the Palestine Red Crescent Society, but hard to know the true extent of the damage, with phone and internet service cut off in Gaza, the third communications blackout of the war.
Hamas systematically exploits hospitals as part of its war machine.
Israel again today accused Hamas of hiding its fighters and military positions behind civilian infrastructure, launching another night of heavy aerial bombardment aimed at wiping out the militant group behind the October 7th attacks. In Ramallah, the occupied West Bank, protesters gathered in a main square as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived in the city for a surprise visit. Blinken meeting with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. The U.S. wants the Palestinian Authority to help govern Gaza when the war is over.
But if you project forward to the future, what we all agree is that in defining that future, in shaping that future for Gaza, for the West Bank, and ultimately for a Palestinian state, Palestinian voices have to be at the center of that.
But the PA is widely criticized as weak and ineffectual. It was ousted from Gaza by Hamas in 2006 after a brief civil war. Not far from their meeting, we met 3 men from Gaza. They were working in Israel, but after October 7th, they were forced to flee, no longer wanted at their jobs, unable to stay in Israel, unable to cross back into Gaza. Israel reportedly detained hundreds of workers from Gaza following the attacks. Hassan al-Sultan is 30 years old. He says 18 of his relatives have been killed during the war. His mother, he says, was injured in a bombing. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has again rejected calls for a ceasefire, meeting with soldiers at an Air Force base not far from Gaza. That won't happen, Netanyahu says, until the more than 200 hostages are freed. Ellen Morrow, CBC News, Ramallah.
Foreign nationals in Gaza remain stuck in limbo today. The Rafah border crossing into Egypt remains closed, striking a blow to the hopes of some Palestinian Canadians who were told by Global Affairs Canada their exit date was soon. They say with each passing day, their situation becomes more desperate. Tom Parry reports from Cairo.
Arriving on the Gaza side of the Rafah crossing with her daughter, their luggage, and their Canadian passports, Siham al-Batnaji was hoping this would finally be the day they both got out. My daughter and I have Canadian citizenship, she says. We've been struggling for 5 days, going back and forth to the Rafah crossing. Despite those efforts, the mother and daughter were today going nowhere. The Rafah crossing was closed again, leaving Canadians and others still stranded. It's a very sad decision. The situation is dangerous, says Majid al-Huwaihi, a Palestinian who holds German citizenship. The shutdown at the Rafah crossing was caused, it seems, by a dispute over transferring Palestinians wounded in Israel's bombardment. Israel attacked a convoy of ambulances on Friday. Palestinians say it was transferring injured patients. Israel says it was being used by Hamas. There have been reports as well of the U.S. accusing Hamas of trying to sneak injured fighters over the border for medical treatment. Whatever the case, Canadians in Gaza and their families back home are caught in the middle.
It's a very frustrating time.
Sama Al-Sabah, who lives in London, Ontario, has been trying to get her 73-year-old father out of Gaza. She says Global Affairs called her dad to say he could leave Monday, provided he could make his way from the north of Gaza to Rafah in the south. But then she says her father got another call.
They contacted my father yesterday, and they told him there has been delays because of the borders being closed today, so you'll be pushed back to Tuesday.
Each day the border is closed, the backlog gets bigger. Some aid shipments have been allowed into Gaza, though aid groups say it's nowhere near enough. Suhair Zakat with the International Committee of the Red Cross knows countries are trying to get their people to safety. But she says they can't forget Palestinians who have nowhere to run.
All civilians should be protected, all civilians should not be harmed, and all conflicting parties, both conflicting parties, should take every possible precautionary measure to reduce the harm of civilians.
But civilians have been paying a heavy price since the beginning of this conflict. Canadians in Gaza are just trying to get out of the way, but they still don't know exactly when that will happen. Tom Perry, CBC News, Cairo.
Here at home, the Liberal government's carbon tax carve-out is still a big topic of conversation. Tomorrow, the House will vote on a motion put forward by the Conservatives to freeze the carbon tax on all forms of home heating. As JP Tasker tells us, even though the motion is non-binding, it's a fight that's far from over.
It is so expensive, and we know that for the long run, we really can't afford to pay that much.
A move from BC to rural Nova Scotia has left Barry Ruger with sticker shock. Last winter, it cost him nearly $5,000 to fill up his home heating oil tank.
It's just frustrating us terribly.
Ottawa's pausing the carbon tax to help people who use this fuel source, but it may not be enough.
I think they need a lot more help than just a few cents a litre on their heating oil.
Federal data shows just 3% of Canadians use oil to heat their homes. The numbers are a lot higher in Atlantic Canada. In Nova Scotia, for example, about 32% use it, according to Statistics Canada. That means they stand to gain more from Ottawa's 3-year tax break.
Nobody can say that it's being implemented fairly today.
That's left other provinces with carbon tax envy. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe.
The way to do that is for the Prime Minister to do the right thing, to be fair to all Canadian families, and to extend his carbon tax pause to all sources of heating oil.
And New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs isn't happy either. People in his province mostly rely on electricity.
It is certainly impacting a lot of folks negatively.
That's where the Conservative leader comes in.
Who's ready to axe the tax?
Pierre Poilievre has a motion before Parliament to apply the carbon tax pause to all forms of home heating, which the NDP says they'll support. That's put the Liberal government on the defensive.
And I think it's okay if we recognize that some policies have a disproportionately positive impact on some regions of the country.
The Prime Minister announced a policy surrounded by Atlantic Canadian MPs, but the senior minister from the region says every Canadian on oil can benefit. Housing Minister Sean Fraser.
This is a smart approach to move forward with the transition towards heat pumps and to see if we can get off home heating oil as a country altogether.
Ruger's open to a subsidized heat pump, but he's had trouble navigating a tangle of red tape. That's another thing Ottawa will have to address, he says.
The paperwork involved is just overwhelming to get into any of these programs.
Pierre Poilievre's motion to extend the carbon tax holiday isn't expected to pass when it's put to a vote tomorrow. But the fight isn't over. Some premiers are threatening to withhold the levy until there's a nationwide reprieve. JP Tasker, CBC News, Ottawa.
And the carbon tax will likely be on the agenda in Halifax as Canada's premiers and territorial leaders gather for 2 days of meetings. But the main focus of the summit is tackling the healthcare crisis. I spoke to Kate McKenna in Halifax for more on that. Kate, do we know any of the potential healthcare solutions the premiers are going to be putting forward?
So this is being billed as a healthcare summit where premiers can come together and talk about what's working and what's not. The theme is innovations in healthcare aimed at improving delivery in Canada. The chair of this meeting, Nova Scotia's Tim Houston, was asked what they'll be talking about. He said one major issue is recruitment. He says provinces are concerned about other provinces recruiting their healthcare workers away, essentially poaching them. That issue, as well as a more general shortage of healthcare workers, was also brought up by British Columbia Premier David Eby.
The need to really bring up additional health professionals to make sure that people get the care they need in communities across our province. I know it's a national issue, and we want to make sure we're not eating each other's lunch by outbidding each other for health professionals, and that we're training in a coordinated way across the country.
We can also expect some discussions around credentials. Houston says there will be talks about how to get more internationally trained healthcare workers recognized and able to work in Canada. He says provinces will need to work with the federal government to do that, but it is top of mind for him and other premiers.
And let's talk about the other big issues for the premiers, the carbon tax and the Canada Pension Plan. Those have both been big points of contention as of late.
We just heard JP talking about the calls for more exemptions to the carbon tax. Some premiers like Saskatchewan's Scott Moe and Ontario's Doug Ford have been pushing for all home heating fuel to be exempt and even for the tax to be abolished altogether. We're expecting more discussion around the carbon tax tomorrow. Houston says we can also expect more conversation around the CPP following Alberta's announcement that it's looking for a path to leave the Canada Pension Plan. Houston says there's room for these conversations at a meeting like this, even if they're done informally.
The focus is on healthcare innovation. There will be other issues discussed by the premiers, whether it's formally on the agenda or informally, for sure. That's just the nature of governing.
We will get a fuller picture of the discussions tomorrow. The premiers are set to hold a news conference in the afternoon to share what they talked about in greater detail.
Kate McKenna in Halifax, thank you so much.
Thank you.
More than 400,000 civil servants in Quebec are going on strike at midnight. Teachers, school staff, and health and social services workers rejected the province's latest contract offer last week. The strike will only last until 10:30 Monday morning, disrupting but not canceling classes at schools. Healthcare workers will work in a reduced capacity but continue to offer essential services. While in Ontario, workers of the province's public broadcaster will return to work on Monday. TVO employees have voted to accept an offer, which the union says provides job security and wage increases. TVO workers went on strike at the end of August. This time next year, Americans will be voting for their next president. And at this moment, things are looking pretty good for Donald Trump. Not only is he gaining momentum in his bid to become the Republican presidential nominee, new polling also shows he's inching past his likely Democratic challenger, President Joe Biden. Katie Simpson has more from Washington.
Donald Trump asserted his dominance in the race to become the Republican presidential nominee, basking in roaring applause at a party summit in Florida, where he picked up endorsements from 7 additional state lawmakers, mocking his challenger, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, on his own turf.
And my people said, "Sir, don't hit him. He's a Republican." And we hit him hard, and now he's like a wounded falling bird from the skies.
In a sign of just how strong Trump's grip is on the party base, this audience wouldn't tolerate a negative word about the frontrunner.
Donald Trump will be found guilty by a jury on a felony offense next year.
Long-shot candidate Asa Hutchinson was booed for bringing up Trump's legal problems, while former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie admonished Trump supporters.
Your anger against the truth is reprehensible.
Trump appears to be on pace to easily win the Republican presidential nomination. And with that, American voters have a pretty solid idea of what the federal election will look like in 2024. Sarah Rinfret is a political science professor at Northern Arizona University.
A lot of things can happen within the next year, but if the election was held today, it looks like we would have Biden versus Trump again, like we did in 2020.
New polling suggests this rematch will be close. According to a New York Times Siena College survey, Trump is leading Joe Biden in 5 out of 6 key swing states. The polling found Biden's age and mental fitness remain key concerns.
There's nothing that the president can do about his age. He's a human being and a good one.
It's part of the reason why lawmaker Dean Phillips launched a long-shot campaign to challenge Biden for the Democratic nomination. The poll also says Biden is losing support among Black and Hispanic voters as well as young voters. There's fresh backlash, too, over the U.S. response to the Israel-Hamas war, on full display at a large pro-Palestinian rally in Washington.
My message to President Biden is, I voted for you, and I regret it.
The numbers are being described as a legitimate concern by David Axelrod, the former powerful strategist for Barack Obama. He mused on social media that it is late in the election cycle to change candidates, but wrote that Biden needs to decide whether his candidacy is in his best interest or the country's. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Washington.
Це не патова ситуація.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is denying the war with Russia is in a stalemate. He made the comments after talks with the EU in Kyiv on Ukraine's bid to join the organization.
Easy! Насыпай!
Ukraine's soldiers in the south continue their counteroffensive. They have made little headway in the last few days. It has been 620 days since Russia's invasion, and there is no end in sight to the fighting. Millions have fled the war between Russia and Ukraine, and they include people from Russia's ethnic minorities who say Moscow is using them as cannon fodder and that they are more likely to be called up to the front lines than their Slavic neighbors. Fears of being sent off to fight in Ukraine have sparked a large exodus, with many fleeing into Kazakhstan and Mongolia, putting a strain on those countries. Anya Besanov reports.
In Almaty's Central Park, kids shriek on carnival rides while a Ferris wheel slowly makes circles in the skyline. 28-year-old Nurgun Antonov takes it all in from a nearby bench, where he sits and reflects on what brought him here to Kazakhstan, 7,000 kilometers from his home in northeastern Russia.
First week of the war was like a sleepy nightmare, as if we were in a thick fog.
Antonov is Yakut, one of the almost 200 different ethnic minorities within Russia, several of which have their own federal republics within the Russian Federation. Antonov fled Russia because he felt people like him were being used as cannon fodder in Russia's war mobilization.
It became immediately clear they weren't mobilizing proportionately. It was disproportionately targeting people from national republics more than the central regions.
Alexei Drakovich teaches Russian history at Western University. He explains why Russia calls up people more from the republics than places like Moscow or St. Petersburg.
They're far from the major cities, and so this allows them to either recruit more or forcibly conscript more without it necessarily ruffling feathers or causing problems in many of the major cities.
And being on the periphery means there are fewer career paths, meaning there's a larger pool of reservists and soldiers to draw from in those regions. An estimated 47,000 Russian soldiers have died in the war. Of those, a little under 1,800 have been from just two of the regions. After Russian President Vladimir Putin announced his partial mobilization in September 2022, it caused a mass exodus from Russia. By the end of the year, nearly 1 million Russian citizens had crossed into Kazakhstan alone. That's not including the thousands of people who fled into its neighboring countries.
For the first time, I would say, in the last 30 years, with the war in Ukraine, we saw a number of people migrating from Russia to Central Asia. And this is a brand new trend.
Timur Umarov is an expert on Central Asia and a fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He says the influx of refugees is creating a new set of problems for the governments of those countries.
Central Asian countries have to understand how are they gonna be dealing with all of the problems of surplus of migrants.
One of those problems, an overwhelming strain was placed on the housing market.
When my wife and I moved here, it wasn't just people from our republic. It was all of Russia. That influenced the availability of housing. The price skyrocketed, and so many people couldn't afford any kind of housing.
Many Kazakhs helped by opening their doors and offering food and beds. Nurgun Antonov was lucky to find a landlord who was willing to rent out her two houses at a reduced rate.
The landlord had the option to rent it out as a commercial property like a hostel, or to help us. She decided it would be better to help us.
Antonov then paid it forward. He and some friends took on the financial burden and offered housing for free to those fleeing from their republic.
We were able to help more than 300 people with shelter.
Antonov says if another mobilization occurs, he's prepared to step in and help the next wave of refugees. Anya Besanov, CBC News, Almaty.
In Nepal, rescue workers continue to dig through rubble, searching for survivors of a deadly earthquake. At least 157 people were killed. The 5.6 magnitude earthquake hit the mountainous country around midnight Saturday. It's Nepal's deadliest earthquake since 2015, when a 7.8 magnitude quake killed around 9,000 people. Police in Hamburg, Germany say a hostage situation at the city's airport has ended peacefully. A 35-year-old man is in custody after he drove a vehicle onto the tarmac Saturday night with his 4-year-old daughter inside. Negotiators were engaged in an overnight standoff with the suspect, who police say was involved in a custody dispute. It forced the closure of Hamburg Airport for 18 hours, canceling more than 100 flights and rerouting several others. The U.S. state of Colorado has been grappling with how to address its overlooked and suppressed history. That includes the stories of violent displacement and forced assimilation of Indigenous peoples. Colorado has recently released the findings of a year-long investigation into the system of Native American boarding schools. As Shannon Young reports from Boulder, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation process has provided a roadmap toward healing.
I think what really struck me in this research was how insidious federal Indian policy was.
Colorado state archaeologist Holly Norton recently penned a report detailing an investigation into the federal Indian boarding schools that operated in Colorado between 1880 and 1920. The purpose of the boarding schools was to sever Indigenous children from their traditional culture. The research was funded by a state law passed last year. Norton's team identified 9 institutions that received federal money, but focused on 2 in particular.
Fort Lewis Indian Boarding School had approximately 1,100 children, and the Grand Junction Indian School, which was also known as the Teller Institute, had approximately 600 students enrolled during its existence.
The children were subject to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse at the schools, and many died. Norton's team found 31 students died at the Fort Lewis School, and another 37 individuals died at the Grand Junction School, including a teacher, a former student, and the daughter of a carpenter. But Norton's team did not rely on archival research alone.
I looked really closely at the work that was going on across both the United States and Canada. Canada has really been at the forefront in some ways, and there is some really good both published and unpublished best practices that have come out, especially for geophysical work.
That geophysical work depended largely on ground-penetrating radar to look for graves and determine if they likely held adults or children. But that's not the only way Canada's own process has influenced investigations in the U.S.
I've been sharing the history of boarding schools and my own family's history for many, many years now.
Attorney Geraldine Decoto is an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa. Both of her parents attended boarding schools. She co-founded the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition after participating in a 2011 symposium with members of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Since then, she says, she's witnessed a shift in public understanding of Indigenous issues.
I really do feel like awareness is changing, the truth is being told, the stories are being shared, and I don't know that we're there yet as far as healing. But we're getting there.
The National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition is advocating for the U.S. federal government to form its own Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Reporting for CBC News, I'm Shannon Young in Boulder, Colorado.
You're listening to The World This Weekend on CBC Radio. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. You can listen to this program anytime on the CBC Listen app or on the CBC News YouTube channel. Canada's athletes are celebrating one of their most successful performances at the Pan American Games in Santiago, Chile. They are bringing home more than 160 medals, including 46 gold. And as Philip Lee Shannock reports, all eyes are now on the Summer Olympics in Paris next year.
On the track, on the water, and even on the dance floor, Team Canada set records and blazed trails at the 2023 Pan American Games. From breakdancing, swimming, and shot put, Canadian athletes won gold in Santiago, Chile, and along with setting Games records, recorded other important firsts. Vancouver's Philip Kim, the 26-year-old, also known as B-Boy Phil Wizard, won a gold medal in breakdancing. He also qualified for a spot at the Paris Olympics, where the sport will be making its debut. Kim told the CBC he was excited to be part of history.
From something like the Olympics, it's a platform that we normally would not have access to. That's the most exciting thing for me, for people to see it and fall in love with it.
CBC sports reporter Rob Pizzo is covering the Pan Am Games. He says with so many competitions, direct Olympic qualifiers, the medals were just part of the goal.
He needed a gold medal to qualify. He did just that.
Canada with a strong finish, and Canada going to spoil the party.
Katie Vincent and Sloane McKenzie won gold in the 500-meter sprint canoe, defeating hosts Chile. In track and field, world champion Ethan Katzberg set 3 Pan Am Games records in the hammer throw, while Nova Scotia's Sarah Mitten also won gold in shot put and is looking forward to Paris.
I really wanted to show everyone that I was a top competitor, and I think I'm proving that more and more. Heading into the Olympic Games, I know that I'm going to be, talked about, a favorite. I mean, I have those same expectations of myself, but I'm just really looking forward to being able to show Canada that we can do it.
Pizzo says for many athletes, the Pan Am Games are not just about qualifying for the Olympics, but a forge where their emotional mettle and maturity is tested under pressure.
They really use these games as kind of a stepping stone. They will usually send a really healthy mixture of veterans and young athletes as well.
And while the next stop might not be Paris for many of these young athletes, they're already training for the next Pan Am Games in 2027 in Colombia. Philip Lee Shannock, CBC News, Toronto.
Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby, light my fire.
It's an especially fiery evening over in the UK. It's Guy Fawkes Night. You know the rhyme, remember, remember the 5th of November. If you're not brushed up on the history, we found a song on the internet to help.
Let me tell you about Guy Fawkes Night. It all goes back to 1605. Guy Fawkes had joined a plot to make the persecution of Catholics stop. He and some other men planned to blow up Parliament.
Thank you so much to the YouTube channel Learn English with Beats. We'll sum up the rest of the story. Guy Fawkes was caught with the gunpowder, arrested, tortured, and hanged. Celebrating the plot's failure, people lit bonfires around London and burned effigies of Fawkes, a tradition that continues to this day.
Gunpowder, treason, and plots. With a hit to the hop.
That tradition also made its way to the former colony of Newfoundland, where it became known as Bonfire Night, the Guy Fawkes bit mostly forgotten. Preparations began at the end of September, according to a documentary from the 80s in the tiny town of Brigus.
Early in the gathering stages, the children go from house to house and from store to store, asking the adults for anything combustible that is no longer in use. Paper, cardboard boxes, pieces of wood, old boats, and discarded furniture. Especially prized now, and the main ingredient in the fires, are rubber tires.
Those kids went jigging or fishing for tires that had been thrown into the harbor. There were also some more mischievous items chosen, says folklorist Dale Jarvis. Here's what he told CBC St. John's morning show host Chrissy Holmes.
It was sort of a time where you could maybe get back at a neighbor who'd been annoying you. You might do something like steal their outhouse, which was apparently, very popular. A very popular item to burn on bonfire night was someone's outhouse. They'd wake up in the morning ready to have their morning ablutions, and the outhouse would be on fire somewhere off on the distance.
These days, Jarvis says, there are more concerns about injuries, as well as the environmental impacts of burning things like tires. So the 400 300-year-old tradition is evolving again. In a lot of communities, volunteer firefighters are now running bonfire night events. We'll leave you with a little more from the Doors on The World This Weekend. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Thanks for listening.
And our love become a funeral pyre. Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby, light my fire. Try to set the night on fire.